I mean, if you break your arm, the X-ray is just, it's binary. The jagged white line is right there on the film.
Right, the doctor just points at it and says, there's the problem.
Exactly. But what if you could take an X-ray of an impending disaster, like a mass tragedy that hasn't even happened yet?
That is the big question.
It is. So today, we are taking you into the murky, kind of terrifying, but ultimately decipherable science of preventing targeted violence.
Yeah, we're going to give you a shortcut to understanding how experts actually decode malicious behavior before it explodes.
And we've got a massive stack of sources for this deep dive. We're looking at medical definitions from the Mayo Clinic, FBI behavioral analysis techniques from American Military University.
That's a really interesting Frontiers meta-analysis on workplace bullying.
Right, and 2 highly specialized threat assessment protocols, the WAVR-21 and the CHEER-IP-18. We're basically going to use real-world case studies like the Florida school board shooting and the Fort Hood attack to, connect the dots.
Because the mission of this deep dive is to trace that entire spectrum of human malice. We're starting with the everyday toxic traits you might see at the office, and then scaling all the way up to extreme warning signs of lone actor violence.
Which is heavy, I know.
It is, but by the end of this conversation, the goal is to equip you to actually see the hidden behavioral patterns in the world around you.
So you'll understand why these tragedies happen, and more importantly, how they sort of telegraph their arrival long before the first blow is struck.
Right, they don't just happen out of nowhere.
Exactly. So to understand how a catastrophic violent event happens, we first have to look at the fundamental building blocks of what we call dark personalities.
The foundation.
Yeah. Based on the Mayo Clinic source, we start with antisocial personality disorder, or ASPD, and the symptoms are essentially a complete, just chilling disregard for right and wrong.
Yeah, these individuals will use charm or wit or mimicry to manipulate others for personal gain.
And they feel absolutely no guilt, no remorse about the wreckage they leave behind. But the detail that really stands out to me here is the timeline.
Oh, right. The early onset.
Yeah. This isn't a personality shift that just, happens when someone hits a midlife crisis. The Mayo Clinic explicitly notes that adults with ASPD almost always show symptoms of a conduct disorder before the age of 15.
We're talking about childhood aggression, early destruction of property.
Chronic rule violations. I mean, the empathy chip is seemingly just missing from the very beginning.
Which is a crucial realization.
Yeah.
Because, we tend to immediately associate those traits with a clinical setting or, a maximum security prison.
They absolutely thrive in our daily lives.
You really do.
Yeah.
The Frontiers meta-analysis explores how these exact traits manifest in everyday environments, specifically the workplace. And it uses a psychological framework known as the Dark Triad.
The Dark Triad.
Which consists of Machiavellianism, Narcissism, and Psychopathy.
So if you're listening to this and suddenly picturing that one hyper-competitive, toxic coworker who takes credit for your projects and undermines people behind closed doors.
That is exactly what we're talking about.
Right. Machiavellianism is the strategic manipulation of others. It's treating colleagues like disposable chess pieces just to advance a personal agenda.
And then narcissism is that deep, really fragile entitlement.
Grandiosity.
Exactly. Demanding constant affirmation and just lashing out when they don't get it. And psychopathy brings the callousness, the impulsivity, and the profound lack of empathy.
And out of all 3 of those, the Frontiers study found that psychopathy is by far the strongest predictor of workplace bullying.
Because the corporate world can actually serve as a highly effective incubator for these personalities.
A petri dish.
Literally. Certain business structures unintentionally reward dark traits. I mean, think about a manager who is entirely callous and manipulative.
But they hit their financial targets.
Exactly. They consistently hit their quarterly targets by completely burning out their team. And they often get promoted rather than punished.
Because the company just values the outcome and ignores the toxic methodology.
Right.
I'm looking at this data on the Dark Triad, and my immediate thought is, well, just screen them out.
You'd think so.
Right. Like, if these individuals are fundamentally wired to disrupt and destroy a team, human resources should just give them a personality test during the interview and filter them out at the door.
But the research says that actually backfires.
Because they just game the test.
They absolutely game the test. I mean, a core feature of psychopathy and Machiavellianism is the ability to read a room. They deliver exactly what the other person wants to hear.
So they're chameleons?
Total chameleons. Relying on clinical screening to catch a skilled manipulator is just a losing battle. Instead, the focus has to shift entirely to the environment itself,
Okay, how so?
through what organizational psychologists call a psychosocial safety climate.
Oh, so instead of trying to spot the shark in the water, you just put up a shark net.
I love that analogy, yeah. Think about the mechanics of how a Machiavellian operates. Their power relies entirely on ambiguity, right?
Mm.
Secrecy, information asymmetry.
They manipulate by playing people against each other in the dark.
Exactly. So a strong psychosocial safety climate neutralizes them by just removing the opportunity.
Right.
When an organization implements radical transparency in decision-making and robust protected reporting mechanisms,
And strict zero-tolerance policies for abusive behavior.
the Machiavellian completely loses their leverage. You don't need to clinically diagnose them. You just make the environment incredibly hostile to their methods.
Without shadows to hide in, their behavior is immediately exposed.
And they either adapt or get forced out.
That makes total sense. You restructure the environment to starve the behavior. But I think we need to look at what happens when these dark traits escalate far beyond office politics or psychological bullying.
Right, the physical aspect.
Yeah, how do we leap from a toxic corporate environment to actual physical violence? Because the Psychology Today source draws a fascinating line in the sand here. It differentiates between the two faces of violence.
Affective and predatory.
Exactly.
And the distinction between the two is foundational to understanding how threat assessors actually evaluate risk. Affective violence is hot-blooded,
So impulsive.
impulsive, reactive, driven by an immediate perceived threat or an insult. Picture a sudden, chaotic bar fight.
Or someone flying into a rage in traffic.
Yeah, it's an emotional explosion. Predatory violence is the polar opposite. It's cold-blooded. It is planned, purposeful, entirely premeditated.
And alarmingly emotionless.
Very. It's the psychopath carefully stalking a target over weeks or months, learning their routines and just waiting for the optimal moment to strike.
I have to pause on this concept of being emotionless during a violent act, though, because it just defies common sense.
It's hard to wrap your head around.
It is. If you are committing an act of extreme, calculated physical violence against another human being, how is it physiologically possible not to feel anything?
Right.
Even if you lack empathy, shouldn't the sheer physical exertion and the adrenaline of the act just cause your heart to pound out of your chest?
The neurobiology of the psychopathic brain during predatory violence is staggering, and it all really comes down to autonomic nervous system arousal.
Okay.
In affective violence, that hot-blooded bar fight we talked about, the individual is experiencing an amygdala hijack. Their adrenaline and cortisol spike dramatically.
Their heart races, their pupils dilate, tunnel vision sets in.
Exactly. It's the textbook mammalian fight-or-flight response.
Their body is treating the situation as an immediate survival event.
But in predatory violence, the data shows minimal to no autonomic arousal. Their pulse often remains at a resting rate. Their breathing is steady.
Wow.
Yeah. The reason for this physiological flatline is that the psychopath is not reacting to a threat. Their brain isn't processing the victim as a fellow human being capable of inducing fear or panic.
They're processing the victim as an object.
As a goal.
Mm-hmm.
To the predator, executing the violent act is no more emotionally taxing than you or I might feel while slicing a loaf of bread.
That's terrifying.
It is a calculated hunt.
A calculated hunt. And if predatory violence is fundamentally a hunt, leaving virtually no emotional or physiological footprint, how on earth do investigators catch someone like that?
Right, because they aren't going to make a careless mistake out of blind rage.
Exactly. Which brings us into the science of behavioral analysis, or profiling. We're looking at the American Military University source now, which details how profilers look at the aftermath of the hunt to reverse engineer the mind of the hunter.
And broadly, crime scenes are categorized into two types: organized and disorganized.
Right.
An organized scene is the hallmark of an organized, calculating mind. The AMU source notes that organized offenders bring their own weapons. They bring physical restraints to maintain control.
And most importantly, they actively try to hide the body or conceal evidence to delay discovery.
Yeah, they plan for the aftermath just as much as the attack itself. Disorganized scenes, conversely, are chaotic and reflective of that affective, impulsive outburst we talked about.
The offender acts spontaneously. They use a weapon of opportunity.
Like a lamp or a kitchen knife left on a counter, and they leave the body in plain view, fleeing in panic and frequently leaving behind massive amounts of biological evidence.
And within that organized category, there's a behavioral nuance that I found completely gripping. Profilers heavily focus on the concepts of staging and masking.
Staging is when a killer poses a scene to deliberately send a message to the police or to fulfill a psychological fantasy.
But masking is purely practical.
Very practical.
Masking is the active attempt to scrub the crime out of existence, cleaning up the blood, wiping down fingerprints, removing the weapon, or transporting the body to a secondary location.
And the deductions that profilers can draw simply from the presence of masking are incredibly powerful.
Because of the sheer cognitive load and the psychological toll it requires, think about the physical reality of cleaning up a violent crime scene.
It is messy, chaotic, and exhausting.
Yeah. For an average person, the instinct after committing an extreme act of violence would be absolute blinding panic. The primal urge is to run as far and as fast as possible.
Plus, every single minute you spend on your hands and knees trying to clean a floor or trying to move a heavy body into a vehicle, you are exponentially increasing your risk of getting caught.
By a neighbor, a roommate, a passerby, it takes a terrifying amount of mental tenacity to stay in that room.
Which means the killer is performing a very specific, high-stakes risk calculation.
Exactly. The only way an offender stays to mask a scene is if the risk of leaving the scene intact is somehow worse than the risk of staying to clean it.
Right.
Therefore, if a killer attempts to mask the scene or move the body, investigators almost instantly know that the killer has a close, undeniable relationship with the victim. Or they live at the primary scene.
Because a random killer like a stranger who broke in simply wouldn't endure that psychological toll.
Or take that massive risk of discovery. A stranger would just flee because nothing at the scene inherently ties back to them. Masking is a massive behavioral tell that the killer is local and known.
It's a brilliant investigative deduction.
Yeah.
But as powerful as profiling is, we have to acknowledge its primary limitation.
Yeah. It's postdictive.
Exactly. It is inherently postdictive. It relies on analyzing a crime scene after the tragedy has already occurred. The ultimate goal of behavioral science isn't just to catch the hunter.
It's to stop the hunt before it begins.
Yes.
Which perfectly transitions us from profiling the aftermath to the science of threat assessment. We are moving to a protocol called the WAVR-21, which stands for Workplace Assessment of Violence Risk.
This is an instrument used by security professionals and psychologists to assess the risk of targeted violence while the subject is still in the planning phase.
And to understand how it works, the source materials apply the WAVR-21 to a chilling real-world case, the 2010 Florida school board shooting by a man named Clay Duke.
The Clay Duke incident provides a textbook, step-by-step example of the pathway to violence. By applying the WAVR-21 framework to his life in the months and years leading up to the attack, we see a perfect, visible storm of risk factors accumulating.
Threat assessors look for specific categories of behavior, starting with motives and stressors.
And Duke's stressors were profound. He was completely broke. His wife had been fired from her job with the school district.
Her unemployment benefits were running out.
Right. And he was harboring a deep, festering resentment toward the government and the board members he blamed for his ruin.
But stressors alone don't equal violence. The WAVR-21 then looks at fantasies and preoccupation. Duke became intensely fixated on the movie V for Vendetta,
which centers on a violent anti-government rebel taking extreme measures.
Yeah. He was so consumed by this identity that during the actual school board attack, he spray-painted the movie's signature circled V on the wall of the meeting room.
That's a huge red flag. Assessors also heavily weigh historical violence. The best predictor of future behavior is past behavior.
Especially when it involves premeditation.
Exactly. In 1999, over a decade before the school board shooting, Duke was arrested for aggravated stalking.
But it wasn't just a threatening phone call. He showed up at his ex-wife's house wearing a mask and a bulletproof vest, armed with 2 handguns, and shot her vehicle's tire.
He had a demonstrated, documented history of engaging in predatory, planned, heavily armed violence.
And then we reached the last resort factor. During the school board meeting, Duke pulled his weapon, ordered everyone except the male board members to leave the room, and his opening statement was simply, "I'm gonna die today."
He had entirely closed off all other options in his mind. He had zero intention of surviving the encounter.
Now, looking at this holistic picture, a man with a history of wearing a bulletproof vest to stalk his ex, a man spiraling into financial ruin, obsessed with violent anti-government media, the question that just screams out is, how did his family and friends miss this?
That is the question.
How did nobody intervene when the red flags were waving so violently?
It is the question that haunts the aftermath of almost every targeted attack. And the psychological mechanisms behind why these signs are missed usually come down to 2 concepts.
Okay.
The first is on the part of the attacker, known as tactical silence. In the early stages of a grievance, individuals often vent loudly. They complain, they threaten, they post online.
But as they transition from a mere grievance to actually planning an attack, they go quiet.
Yes, they realize that making noise might invite police intervention and ruin their plan. So they actively conceal their preparations, presenting a calm exterior while building a bomb in the garage.
So the sudden quiet isn't a sign that they've moved on, it's a sign that they've moved to the operational phase.
Exactly. The second factor lies with the family and friends, and it is rooted in profound psychological denial. Cognitive dissonance is incredibly powerful.
Meaning?
When you love someone, your brain desperately wants to protect you from the unthinkable reality that your husband or brother is capable of mass murder.
Oh, what?
So when family members see a piece of anomalous behavior like purchasing a firearm they don't need or spending hours fixated on extremist content, the brain immediately supplies a benign rationalization.
Like, oh, he's just stressed about money.
Or he's just blowing off steam. The human mind will bend over backward to explain away the terrifying implications of what is right in front of them.
Tactical silence masking the preparation and the protective bubble of denial blinding the family, it is a devastating combination.
It really is.
Now, the WAVR-21 is an incredible tool for assessing workplace, campus, or deeply personal grievances. But how do experts evaluate someone whose primary motivation isn't a personal firing or bankruptcy, but a broader ideological cause?
Right. For ideological and lone actor terrorist threats, assessors transition to a different framework. The TRP-18.
Which stands for the Terrorist Radicalization Assessment Protocol.
Yes, it was designed to map the psychological journey of someone radicalizing toward mass violence. And the TRP-18 is divided into two distinct components.
10 distal characteristics, which are long-term underlying traits that require monitoring.
And 8 proximal warning behaviors, which are immediate, active red flags that demand urgent intervention.
I find it really helpful to visualize the TRP-18 framework like a house fire.
Oh, I like this.
Yeah, the 10 distal characteristics are like someone slowly stacking dry kindling, paper, and gasoline in a living room over a period of years.
The kindling itself isn't actively burning.
Right, but it tells you the environment is incredibly dangerous and primed for a catastrophe. The 8 proximal behaviors, however, are the struck match.
Yeah.
When you see those, the timeline shrinks to 0. It tells you an explosion is imminent.
And to see how the kindling and the match interact, the source materials apply the TRP-18 to the devastating 2009 Fort Hood attack carried out by Nidal Malik Hassan. He was a psychiatrist in the U.S. Army.
And before we walk through the specifics of this case, we need to be crystal clear with you, the listener. We are about to discuss ideological and political details that are highly sensitive and tragic.
Very sensitive, yes.
And we are impartially reporting these details exactly as they are documented in the academic and investigative source materials provided to us. We are not taking any political sides.
Not at all.
Nor are we validating any ideological viewpoints. Our sole objective is to examine the psychological mechanics of how this specific individual radicalized using the clinical lens of the TRP-18 framework.
That context is absolutely vital. So, when we look at Hassan's life leading up to the attack, we see a massive accumulation of that dry, kindling, the distal characteristics.
First, he suffered from thwarted occupational goals.
Right. He's a military psychiatrist who was absolutely terrified of his impending deployment to a combat zone in Afghanistan.
Right.
And his desperate administrative attempts to avoid the deployment were completely failing.
And second, the TRP-18 notes a failure of sexual pair bonding.
Yes, despite intense efforts, he was unable to form a romantic relationship or find a spouse.
Which isn't just about loneliness. Psychologically, it represents a profound lack of an emotional anchor or a stake in conventional society.
Exactly. And third, there was a heavy escalating dependence on a virtual community. He wasn't just reading articles online.
He was actively emailing a known radical cleric, Anwar al-Awlaki.
Hassan sent 18 messages explicitly seeking religious and moral justification for committing violence against his own military colleagues.
So the kindling is definitely stacked. He is isolated, desperate to avoid deployment, and actively seeking permission for violence.
Then the proximal warning behaviors, the struck matches, begin to appear in rapid succession. The TRP-18 identifies pathway behavior, which means active, tangible preparation.
Hassan purchased an FN-57 handgun. That's a weapon known for its high capacity and armor-piercing capabilities.
And crucially, he didn't practice at the firing range on his military base. He specifically drove 35 miles away to an outdoor civilian shooting range to practice, actively avoiding the scrutiny of his colleagues.
Then we see what the protocol calls identification behavior. He had business cards printed, but he completely omitted his military rank and medical credentials.
Instead, the cards identified him as a soldier of Allah.
He was psychologically separating himself from his oath and entirely adopting the identity of a combatant for his cause.
We also see a terrifying phenomenon known as an energy burst. This is a sudden, anomalous spike in activity related to the attack just hours or days beforehand.
And 2 days prior to the shooting at Fort Hood, Hassan, a man who was deeply religious and socially isolated, went to a strip club and sat entirely alone for hours.
And immediately after, he went to the shooting range and rapidly fired over 200 rounds. It was a chaotic, intense surge of final preparation and psychological unspooling.
And finally, there was leakage. Just before the attack, he essentially told a colleague that the army will pay. He was leaking his violent intent to third parties, unable to contain the pressure of what he was about to do.
When you look at the progression through the lens of the Triop 18, the narrative shifts completely. It transforms from a sudden, unimaginable, unpredictable tragedy into a stark, visible, almost mechanical pathway to violence.
And that is the ultimate takeaway of this deep dive. When you learn to see the mechanisms behind the behavior, nothing is truly invisible.
Exactly.
Let's take a step back and look at the vast territory we've covered today. We started by examining the dark triad traits of a toxic coworker, understanding how Machiavellianism and psychopathy thrive in ambiguous corporate environments.
And how transparency is the only way to neutralize them.
We explored the chilling physiological realities of predatory violence, where a flatlining heart rate separates a calculated hunt from a hot-blooded reaction.
We walked through the intense cognitive load required to mask a crime scene and how that effort instantly reveals the killer's proximity to the victim.
And finally, we decoded the cutting-edge threat assessment tools, the WAVR-21 and the TRIAP 18, tracking the specific warning behaviors that precede a tragedy.
Understanding these frameworks strips away the terrifying mystery of what the media too often labels as, senseless acts. To the attacker, these acts are never senseless. They follow a deeply internalized, rigid logic.
Right.
By learning about these distal traits and proximal warning behaviors, you empower yourself. You gain the ability to see the invisible behavioral patterns in human nature.
It makes you a more observant, informed, and ultimately safer person in your daily life. Whether you're navigating complex office politics or noticing a drastic, unsettling change in someone you know.
You stop seeing just the surface and you start seeing the machinery underneath.
But as we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over on your own. As we looked at the case studies of Clay Duke and Nedal Malik Hassan, a glaring, undeniable pattern emerged.
You'll have massive flashing clues online.
Duke was posting anti-government manifestos and uploading references to violent movies on his Facebook page just days before he walked into that school board meeting.
And Hassan was sending dozens of emails to known extremists, explicitly seeking permission for violence.
In an era where our virtual lives are often louder, more transparent, and more meticulously documented than our physical ones, where does threat assessment go next?
That's a great question.
Will our digital footprints eventually become the ultimate tool for preventing violence? Could algorithms and artificial intelligence one day be trained to reliably flag these proximal warning behaviors? The online leakage, the digital energy bursts, the radicalization rabbit holes before the attacker even takes their first real-world step?
It's a question that balances the incredible potential of saving lives against the profound complexities of surveillance and privacy.
It really is. We'll leave you to think on that. Until next time, keep analyzing the patterns around you.